Greetings. So we're moving on now to Chapter 4, which has the sometimes confusing title, Work versus Work. Work, in quotes, meaning did something that I wanted it to do, and work without quotes meaning had a good effect, did some useful work in the social system. I devoted a whole chapter to this because I think this is one of the most important criteria we need to be able to focus on if we're going to ask ourselves what was the value, what was the impact of a nonviolent event. If we don't understand this properly, we're going to just come up with the wrong answer time after time. So I spend a good deal of time showing that when you do something with nonviolent energy, it will have a good effect. And when you do something with violent energy, it will have a bad effect. The situation that we're locked into right now with these Mideast wars, an attempt to use negative, destructive energy to solve a very difficult problem. And if you use that kind of energy, it'll only make matters worse. Whereas if you use nonviolent energy, it will make matters better. You also have to learn exactly how to use it. There's strategic thinking that goes into this. But right now, what we're focusing on is how do we learn from the history of nonviolence? You can go to, let's take one classic example, was the Salt March, kind of the climax of the freedom struggle in India. And you could say, if you were only interested in did it work, unquote, you could say that it failed because it was a protest against unfair taxation of salt in a country where salt was desperately needed and almost the only condiment that a poor person could afford. It failed because the salt tax was not repealed. And yet everyone knew that because of the confrontation that we sometimes call a nonviolent moment, where the protesters, the satyagrahis, did their very best. And the regime, with their clubs and batons, they did their very worst. And while the protesters didn't get exactly what they wanted, they didn't get into the salt pans and take the salt, so you could say this didn't work in the short, right in that scene, or in the campaign as a whole, everybody knew that this was the end of the British Raj in India. So Gandhi may not have consciously known that things were going to turn out exactly that way. And incidentally, he was not even eating salt at that time, so it's just an interesting little personal history factor there. But if you know what to look for, you will see that the formula that's developed on page 106 is accurate, and I sometimes think that if your students can take away only one thing from this book, it should be that formula, which is that violence sometimes works, gets what you want, and it never works. It never introduces constructive energy into the situation to make things better. Nonviolence sometimes works, so they're even up to this point, but the difference is that it always works. It always injects constructive, healing force into the social environment. And there are so many cases, many of them in Search for a Nonviolent Future, where people have failed to get exactly what they wanted in the short term, but they got something that they could not even have dreamed of. So please remember that formula and bring it to the attention of your students. Violence sometimes works, but never works. Nonviolence sometimes works and always works. If the language confuses them, you can say nonviolence sometimes succeeds, but it always works, or however you want to recast it. So then on page 97, we have started actually looking at cases, and I systematically took one case after another to make one different point after another about nonviolence. Perhaps I should add that since I talk about a little episode that happened to me personally and some colleagues around the late 90s when there was this episode between the Serbian regime and the Kosovar Albanians. I should add that since then, it's come to my attention that there's a very fine documentary by York and Zimmerman put out by the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict called Bringing Down a Dictator. This documentary shows how in one day a student-led movement turned a rather unscrupulous, brutal dictator, Slobodan Milosevic, out of power. And while the film, I'm not sure, brings this out, the fact is that he had withstood 11 weeks of NATO bombing at a cost of over $3 billion. And here in one day, at a cost of only $20 million, he was, well, $20 million for a year of preparation, he was turned out of power. So that gives us a really nice test case to measure the relative effectiveness of nonviolence against violence, even for a specific task. But starting on page 100, we get to what must be, from some criteria, the most important case in the book, and that is the case of the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration that took place in Berlin in 1943. Because you will always hear it would not have worked against the Nazis, or it would not have worked against somebody else. Now, when you hear that question from your students, I would suggest you do two things. First, suggest to them that looking for ways that nonviolence might not have worked, or seems not to have worked, you'll never understand what it is. The right heuristic policy here, the right way to learn, is to look at cases where it did work, or aspects of a positive effect that it did have, and ask yourself why. How come it worked? Because then you can take that power and develop it, use it in whichever way you wish. And incidentally, by the time we're finished with these cases, I'll also be showing that nonviolence has worked in many different situations, in many different directions. But the second thing that, the second reason that we need to know, actually there are three. The second reason we need to know about the Rosenstrasse prison demonstration is that in fact it defeated the Nazis. So people say it never would have worked against the Nazis. It actually did work against the Nazis, and there's no reason to believe it could not have been used more systematically, more persistently, and who knows, if it had been applied early enough, conceivably it could have made the Nazi regime impossible. At, of course, a great deal of cost in suffering. The more it would cost in suffering would be determined by how long you had waited to apply it. The third thing it's useful to know about Rosenstrasse 4 is how long it took us to find out about it, and how, in fact, today, many, many people don't know about it, even though the evidence is there in this marvelous book, Resistance of the Heart, by Nathan Stolzfus. But I point out that even I, who am in this field professionally with my whole life, didn't know about his book until relatively recently. So we're very, very bad, we have been very, very bad at doing the history of nonviolence, and that's why your students will say, but it never happened, it couldn't have happened, and so forth. I draw your attention also to the escalation curve on page 108, because that begins to show us in a rather concrete way that nonviolence can be approached purely scientifically. There are degrees of alienation, and they require degrees of love to be overcome. And often when we do nonviolence and we say it didn't work, it's because we used a very small amount of nonviolence for a very large amount of alienation or dehumanization. And we need to know the problem that we're facing. We need to know how far along it is and how intense before we know how and what kind of and how much of nonviolence to bring to bear against it. Incidentally, since we did that chart, it's almost 10 years old now, we have elaborated on that escalation curve and put in a few more parameters. And here at the Meta Center, we can show you that picture if you like. Then on page 111, I talk about two big historical examples where there actually was something like a nonviolent regime. Because we always think, okay, the people have to use nonviolence against an oppressive regime. And of course, that's much more common. But if there's even one case, this shows that it's possible, right? Kenneth Boulding used to say, if something has happened, it is possible. He called that Boulding's first law. So the case of the Holy Experiment, which was in the colony of Pennsylvania in the 18th century, 17th, 18th, and the case of the Empire of Ashoka in north-central India in the 3rd century of our era. These were both attempts, and there probably have been others, to rule a country on nonviolent principles. And again, there's no reason to think that the experiment failed on its own merits. It failed because we didn't know how to read the history, we didn't understand what was happening, and we allowed external forces to intervene. Then on page 117, I talk about a case that was quite famous during the Cold War, and this is called the Prague Spring Uprising of summer of 1968 on into 1969, where the citizens of Prague and other parts of what was then Czechoslovakia resisted a massive invasion from 3 directions by Warsaw Pact armies bent on dismantling the reforms of President Dubček. And it was calculated that the resistance would collapse in 4 days because, again, you had all the guns on the side of the invading armies, 500,000 men. And yet it lasted for 8 months, and it only really came apart when the leadership was brought to Moscow and pressured, and eventually they had to go back on their principles, and I mean, to put it kind of harshly, they betrayed the movement. But there was a magic moment there, 8 months long, where this incredible power of popular resistance based on courage and humor was being carried out, and it kept these armies out of the country for 8 months in a way which the Czechs could never possibly have done if they tried to use military power. And even if they had enough military power to do it, the cost in human life would have been enormous, and the relationship among the countries involved at the end of the story would have been very bad, meaning that you'd have a rollover and the violence would come back again, like World War I turning into World War II. When the German armies receded at the end of World War I, the French said, "Ils reviendront," they'll be back, and indeed they were. But when you solve something non-violently, you don't have that kind of repercussion. So the final point I try to make in this chapter, Work versus Work, chapter 4, is that nonviolence is not a black and white thing. It's not good or bad. It's not to be looked at in a moral framework. It can be looked at in a scientific framework. The only thing is we have to adjust our vision because we're not used to doing science on what goes on inside of us. So we showed in the preceding chapter that nonviolence starts within the individual. It can go to scale in the sense that it can become a mass movement. It can go to scale in the sense that it can be spread out over time. It can be a permanent acquisition of a person. And now we're starting to show how that plays out in a variety of circumstances and how we can analyze it and build upon it. Thanks very much.